The morning sky was painted with soft pink and orange streaks as the first rays of sunlight touched the sleepy town of Maplewood. The streets were still quiet, only a few birds chirping and the occasional car rolling by. Life in Maplewood moved, at a slow, peaceful pace. People knew each other by name, kids played outside without worry, and everyone felt safe. But today, something would happen that would shake that peace and bring attention not just to the town, but far beyond it. At the edge of town near the old high school, a young girl named Lila walked with her head down, focused on the path ahead. She was 16 years old, smart, polite, and always carried herself with quiet confidence. Her dark skin gleamed slightly in the morning light, and she wore her uniform neatly: white shirt, black skirt, and black shoes. Her backpack was heavy, with books, but she didn't complain. Lila had lived in Maplewood for 2 years now, ever since her family moved there from the city. She had made a few friends, kept mostly to herself, and worked hard in school. What most people didn't know was that Lila wasn't just any ordinary student. She was the daughter of Mayor Thompson, one of the most powerful people in the state. But no one in town knew that. Not even her teachers or classmates. Lila had begged her father to let her live a normal life. She wanted to be treated like everyone else, not like the mayor's daughter. He agreed, and so she went by Lila James, a regular student trying to get through high school like anyone else. It wasn't always easy, but she managed. She didn't want special treatment or extra attention. She just wanted to grow up like any other kid. That morning, however, things didn't go according to plan. As Lila turned the corner onto Fifth Avenue, she heard the loud wail of a siren behind her. She stepped to the side, thinking the police car would pass by like usual. But instead, the car came to a sudden stop right in front of her. 2 officers stepped out, one tall and thin, the other shorter and broad-shouldered. They looked serious, almost tense. Lila froze. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't breaking any rules. So why were they stopping her? The taller officer approached first, asking for identification. Lila reached into her bag nervously and pulled out her student ID card. She handed it over, heart pounding in her chest. The officer looked at the picture, then back at her, then at his partner. Something in their eyes told her they weren't convinced. Without warning, the shorter officer stepped forward and grabbed the bottom of her skirt. Lila gasped and took a step back, her face burning with shock and shame. "What are you doing?" she whispered, voice trembling. The officer mumbled something about checking if she was hiding anything. Lila couldn't believe what was happening. She felt exposed, humiliated. She looked around, hoping someone would see this and help her. But the street was empty except for a few cars passing by. Then the officer said something that made her blood run cold. He mentioned a recent theft at a local store. Someone had been seen running away with stolen goods, and the description matched her. Lila shook her head. "That's not me," she said firmly. "I was home last night." But the officer didn't seem to care. He asked her to wait while he radioed in the information. Lila stood there frozen in place, tears forming in her eyes but refusing to fall. Just then, another car pulled up behind the police vehicle. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows came to a stop, and out stepped Mayor Thompson himself. His face was twisted with anger and worry. He stormed toward Lila and pulled her into a tight hug. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice shaking. Lila nodded silently, too stunned to speak. The officers immediately backed off, realizing who they were dealing with. Mayor Thompson turned to the officers, his voice low but full of fury. "Who gave you the right to touch my daughter like that? Who told you to treat her like a criminal?" The officers tried to explain, saying they had received a tip and were only doing their job. But the mayor wasn't interested in excuses. He demanded answers, names, and an apology. The officers stammered, clearly embarrassed and afraid. Word of the incident spread fast. By lunchtime, everyone in town knew what had happened. Parents were furious. Teachers talked about it in hushed tones. Students whispered in the hallways, some curious, others upset. That afternoon, a small group of parents gathered outside City Hall, holding signs and calling for justice. Reporters showed up, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into faces. The mayor held a press conference later that evening, speaking strongly about respect, dignity, and the need for change. Lila sat in her room that night, staring out the window. She couldn't stop replaying the moment the officer touched her skirt. It felt like a violation, like a part of her had been taken without permission. She didn't want to be famous for this. She didn't want to be known as the mayor's daughter or the girl who got mistreated by the police. But she also knew that what happened to her wasn't just about her. It was about every young black girl who had ever been judged before being understood. It was about fairness, about power, about how people saw others based on looks instead of truth. The next day at school, everything was different. Some students avoided her, unsure of what to say. Others came up to her quietly, offering support. A few teachers stopped by her classroom just to check in, but Lila felt like a spotlight had been turned on her, and she wasn't sure if she liked it. Still, she knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of something bigger than herself. And whether she wanted it or not, her story was about to change everything. The town of Maplewood had never seen anything like it. Within hours of the mayor's press conference, phones were ringing off the hook at City Hall, reporters flooded the streets outside, and social media exploded with reactions from across the country. People were angry, confused, and curious. How could something like this happen in a quiet town known for its peace and order? The video clips, some blurry, some clear, showed Lila standing there shocked and embarrassed as one of the officers lifted her skirt. That moment was shared again and again, spreading faster than anyone could stop it. Lila didn't want to leave her room. She had always wanted to be treated like everyone else, but now she felt like the whole world was watching her. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, strangers, and even people she hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered support, saying they believed her and stood with her. Others sent cruel words, claiming she was making it up or that she should just forget it. Lila read them all, but she didn't reply. She didn't know what to say. Her heart was heavy, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's hand pulling at her skirt. Mayor Thompson tried his best to protect his daughter. He kept her out of school for a few days, letting her rest and gather her thoughts. But he also knew that silence wouldn't fix what had happened. He called for an emergency meeting with the town's police chief, demanding a full investigation into the officer's actions. The chief agreed, though he looked deeply uncomfortable. He promised that if the officers had broken any rules, they would face consequences. But for many people in Maplewood, that wasn't enough. Parents organized another protest outside the police station the next day. They held signs that read, "Justice for Lila," "Protect our children," and "No more racial profiling." Local news stations showed footage of the crowd, chanting together, calling for change. A few teachers joined in after school let out, showing their support for Lila and the message her story had become. Even students started talking about it in class, asking questions about fairness, power, and how young black girls are often judged before being understood. Inside the police station, tension ran high. The two officers who stopped Lila were placed on temporary leave while the investigation continued. Their names were not released publicly, but rumors flew around town like wildfire. Some said they were new recruits with little training. Others claimed they had been warned before about treating people unfairly. Either way, their actions had shaken the trust between the community and the people sworn to protect it. At home, Lila finally stepped outside after 3 days of hiding from the world. She walked slowly through her backyard, trying to clear her mind. Her father sat nearby, watching her carefully. He didn't push her to talk, but he was always ready when she was. Finally, Lila sat beside him and whispered, "Why did they do it?" The mayor looked at her, sadness in his eyes. "Because they made a mistake," he said gently. "But more than that, because they saw you first as a threat instead of a child." That answer stayed with Lila for a long time. She thought about it as she returned to school the next week. Walking through the halls felt different now. Some students stared at her, others smiled kindly, and a few avoided her completely. She missed the days when no one paid attention to her, when she could just blend in and live quietly. But she also realized that maybe blending in wasn't always the safest thing. Maybe sometimes being seen was important, even if it hurt. One morning, a girl named Mia approached her during homeroom. Mia wasn't someone Lila knew well, but she was kind and always seemed to listen more than she spoke. She handed Lila a folded piece of paper and whispered, "Read this when you're alone." Later that day, Lila opened it in the bathroom stall and found a short note. "I've been stopped by the police before too. I know how it feels. You're not alone." Lila stared at those words for a long time. She didn't cry, but she felt something shift inside her, a small spark of strength growing slowly. That night, she sat at her desk and typed a post on her personal social media account. It wasn't long, but it carried weight. She wrote about how it felt to be judged based on appearance, how fear can twist the truth, and why trust matters so much between communities and those who serve them. She posted it without telling anyone, unsure if it would matter. But within minutes, likes and comments began pouring in. Some came from people she knew, others from complete strangers. One comment stood out. "You're brave for speaking up. Thank you for sharing your truth." Word spread again, but this time it was different. Lila wasn't just the victim anymore. She was becoming a voice. Schools reached out, asking if she would speak at assemblies. Activists shared her post, encouraging others to share their own stories. And in Maplewood, things started to shift. The town council announced plans to review police procedures and improve community outreach programs. The chief of police gave a public apology on live television, promising better training and more accountability. Still, not everyone agreed with what was happening. Some residents believed the officers were only doing their job and that Lila's case was being blown out of proportion. They left harsh comments online, arguing that the system worked the way it was supposed to, but others pushed back, reminding people that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about learning, growing, and protecting those who need it most. As weeks passed, Lila found herself changing. She still felt pain from what happened, but she also found purpose in it. She began working with local youth groups, helping other kids understand their rights and how to stand up for themselves. She met with teachers and parents to discuss bias and how it affects young people. And slowly she began to feel like she was taking back control of her own story. One evening, as she sat on the porch with her father, she asked him, "Do you think things will really change?" He looked out at the sky for a moment before answering. "Change doesn't come easy," he said. "But it starts with moments like yours, moments that make people stop and think, that make them realize how powerful their choices are." Lila nodded, taking in his words. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing. The town of Maplewood was changing. What had started as a single moment, Lila standing on the sidewalk, humiliated by the very people meant to protect her, had turned into something much bigger than anyone could have predicted. Schools held new discussions about fairness and respect. Parents talked more openly with their children about how to handle difficult situations. Even the local newspaper began publishing weekly columns on youth rights and police accountability. It was as if Lila's story had cracked open a door that had been shut for too long. Back at school, things were still awkward for Lila, but not in the same way. At first, she felt like everyone was watching her, waiting for her to say or do something dramatic. But as time passed, she noticed small changes. Teachers who once ignored certain topics now brought them up in class. Students who had never spoken out before were suddenly raising their hands, sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment. One boy even stood up during a history lesson and asked why no one had ever taught them about how young Black people were often treated differently by authority figures. The teacher didn't have an answer right away, but she promised to look into it. Outside of school, Lila continued receiving messages from people all over the country. Some came from teenagers who had gone through similar things. Others were from adults who wished someone had stood up for them when they were younger. A few even came from police officers who said they were sorry for what happened to her and believed that change was necessary. She read every message carefully, sometimes responding, sometimes just sitting with the words, letting them sink in. One afternoon, she got a letter in the mail. It wasn't from a stranger, though. It was from the mayor of a nearby city. He invited her to speak at a youth leadership event he was hosting later that year. Leela stared at the letter for a long time, unsure if she was ready for something like that. She had never considered herself a speaker or a leader. She had only wanted to live a normal life. But then she thought about everything that had happened since that morning on Fifth Avenue. Maybe this was part of her path now. Maybe she could help other kids avoid the pain she had felt. She told her father about the invitation that night at dinner. He looked proud but also cautious. "It's your choice," he said simply. "If you feel like you can handle it, I'll support you. If not, that's okay too." Lila nodded, thinking it over. That night she sat at her desk and wrote back to the mayor, accepting his offer. Weeks later, dressed in a simple black dress and flats, Lila stepped onto a stage in front of hundreds of students, teachers, and community leaders. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she took a deep breath and began to speak. She told her story, not just the moment with the police, but what came after. How she had felt lost, scared, and angry. How she had found strength in others' stories and realized that her voice mattered. She spoke about fear, power, and the importance of seeing people for who they really are instead of making assumptions based on looks. When she finished, there was silence for a moment. Then slowly, applause filled the room. Not loud or wild, but steady and full of meaning. As she stepped off the stage, a group of students rushed up to her, thanking her for speaking out. One girl hugged her tightly and whispered, "You made me feel less alone." After the event, news outlets picked up her speech. Clips of it played online, shared widely across social media. People praised her bravery and honesty. Some called her a role model. Others said she was inspiring a new generation of young leaders. But Lila didn't see herself that way. She still saw herself as just a girl who had gone through something hard and was trying to make sense of it. Still, the attention kept growing. More invitations came in, from schools, organizations, even national television shows. Lila accepted. Some declined others. She knew she couldn't take on everything, but she wanted to use her voice while it still felt right. Her father helped her manage the requests, making sure she didn't get overwhelmed. They talked often about what she wanted next, what kind of future she imagined for herself. At home, things were quiet again, but different. The house no longer felt like a place to hide, but a place to rest and reflect. Lila spent more time reading, writing, and thinking about the world around her. She started journaling regularly, recording her thoughts and feelings. Sometimes she wrote about her fears, sometimes about her hopes. One entry read, "I used to think being invisible was safe. Now I know that being seen is powerful, even if it hurts sometimes." Meanwhile, in the police department, changes were finally starting to take shape. The chief had announced a new training program focused on bias, communication, and youth interaction. Officers were required to attend workshops and participate in community events. Some resisted at first, but others saw the value in learning how to build trust instead of breaking it. The two officers involved in Lila's case faced consequences. They were suspended without pay for several months and required to complete additional training before returning to duty. Though many in Anyarzem, the town believed the punishment should have been harsher, it was still a step forward. The mayor made sure the public was informed about every decision, keeping transparency at the center of the process. Even within the town council, conversations were shifting. New policies were proposed to improve youth safety and reduce unnecessary confrontations between students and law enforcement. Parents were given more resources to talk to their kids about their rights. Schools introduced programs aimed at helping students understand how to handle real-life conflicts with confidence and care. For Lila, these changes didn't erase what had happened, but they reminded her that progress was possible. She still carried the memory of that day, the officer touching her skirt, the shame, the fear. But now she also carried something else. Hope. Not the kind that ignores pain, but the kind that grows from it. The kind that says, "This happened, but it doesn't have to happen again." As spring rolled into summer, Lila found herself smiling more. She spent time with friends, went on long walks, and even joined a local book club. Life wasn't perfect, but it was better, and every time she passed a police car, she no longer felt afraid. She felt aware, alert, ready. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft shades of orange and purple, Lila sat outside with her father. He looked at her and smiled. "You've changed a lot of lives," he said, softly. Lila shook her head. "No," she replied. "We changed them together." And in that moment, surrounded by the quiet peace of Maplewood, she believed it. The town of Maplewood was still buzzing with the changes that had begun after Lila's story went public. What started as a shocking moment on a quiet street had turned into a movement, one that no one could ignore. People who had once stayed silent were now speaking up, asking questions and demanding better for the next generation. But not everyone was happy about it. Some older residents believed the town was making too much noise over what they called a simple misunderstanding. They said the officers were only doing their job, and that kids these days were too quick to take offense. These voices were loud in community meetings and online comment sections, but they were slowly being drowned out by those calling for real change. Parents, teachers, and young people alike were pushing harder than ever to make sure that something like this never happened again. Inside the police station, things were shifting. The chief had started weekly training sessions focused on bias, communication, and how to interact with young people without fear or aggression. Officers were now required to go through updated procedures before approaching anyone, especially minors. There were new rules about body cameras, clear guidelines for stops, and a stronger focus on respect and dignity. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Lila watched all of this unfold from a distance. She had returned to school full-time and tried to live as normally as possible. But even as she walked the halls, sat in class, and ate lunch with her friends, she could feel the weight of what had happened still pressing on her shoulders. Some students looked at her differently now, not with fear or pity, but with admiration. A few even came up to her quietly, telling her that because of her, they had found the courage to speak up about things that had been bothering them for years. One day, during lunch, a boy named Marcus approached her table. He was a senior, tall and soft-spoken, someone Lila didn't know well but had seen around school. He stood there for a second before finally saying, "I just wanted to say thank you." Lila looked up, surprised. "For what?" she asked. Marcus shrugged. "For standing up, for not letting them just sweep it under the rug. I've been stopped before too, not by those cops, but others. And I always felt like I had to stay quiet." He paused, then added, "But seeing what you did made me realize maybe I don't have to." Lila didn't know what to say at first. She simply nodded and gave him a small smile. That night, she thought about his words long after she should have been asleep. It wasn't just about her anymore. Her experience had become a spark for others, lighting something inside people who had spent years feeling unseen. Outside of school, Lila continued to receive messages from across the country. Some came from teenagers who had gone through similar situations and wanted advice on how to handle them. Others were from adults who wished someone had stood up for them when they were younger. One message came from a mother whose daughter had been treated unfairly by school security. She wrote, "Thank you for giving my girl the strength to tell me what happened. We're fighting for her now, and we wouldn't have if she hadn't seen your story." Lila read that message twice before putting her phone down. She didn't cry, but something deep inside her shifted. She realized that pain had led to power, and power had led to purpose. She had started this journey feeling broken, but now she was helping others find their voice. Her father noticed the change in her. He saw how she carried herself differently, how she spoke with more confidence, how she listened more deeply. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he asked, "Do you regret any of it?" Lila thought about it for a long moment before answering. Not anymore, she said softly. It hurt. It still does sometimes. But if this is what it took to help other people feel safe, then maybe it was worth it. The mayor didn't push her further. He simply nodded, proud, but also protective. He knew better than anyone how hard it was to be in the spotlight, how heavy responsibility could feel when it landed on young shoulders. He also knew that Lila wasn't finished yet. There was still more she wanted to do, more she needed to say. And she did. In the weeks that followed, Lila agreed to speak at another event, a youth empowerment conference in the state capitol. This time, she wasn't nervous. She practiced her speech, wrote down her thoughts, and stood in front of the mirror rehearsing until she felt ready. When the day arrived, she stepped onto the stage wearing a simple white blouse and black pants, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked out at the crowd of hundreds and smiled. She told her story again, but this time she added something new. She talked about healing, about how it wasn't fast or easy, but necessary. She spoke about forgiveness, not for the people who had wronged her, but for herself. She shared how she had learned to carry her pain without letting it define her. And when she finished, the room exploded in applause. Afterward, dozens of people lined up to meet her. Some brought flowers, others hugged her tightly. A group of high school girls asked if they could take a photo with her. A young boy handed her a drawing he had made of her standing strong on a stage. She thanked everyone, accepting each gesture with gratitude. That night, as she drove home with her father, she stared out the window and whispered, "I think I'm starting to understand why this happened." He glanced at her from the driver's seat. "Why?" he asked gently. Lila sighed. "Because someone needed to remind people that every kid deserves to feel safe. Even the ones who look different. Even the ones who get stopped for no reason. Especially them." The mayor didn't respond right away. He simply reached over and squeezed her hand, holding it tight as the city lights blurred past outside the window. Back in Maplewood, the town was still changing. The school board had voted to include new lessons on youth rights and fair treatment in the curriculum. The police department had launched a mentorship program where officers worked directly with students, building trust instead of fear. And parents were talking more openly with their kids about how to handle difficult situations with confidence and care. Lila knew the work wasn't done. She knew that change was slow, and that some people would resist it, but she also knew that progress was happening one step at a time. And as she lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, she realized something important. She wasn't just the girl who got mistreated by the police anymore. She was the girl who fought back, and she wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Lila's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. What started as a moment of shame and fear had turned into something much bigger than herself. People now looked to her for guidance, strength, and truth. But with that attention came pressure. Pressure to speak perfectly, act bravely, and always be ready to fight for what was right. Some days it felt like too much. Other days it reminded her why she couldn't stop. Back at school, things were different but not perfect. Teachers tried harder to include discussions about fairness and identity in their lessons. Students talked more openly about how they were treated based on how they looked or where they came from. Lila found herself speaking up more often, asking questions when something didn't feel right. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She was trying to make sure everyone learned from what had happened to her. One afternoon, during a group project, in history class, one of her classmates made a joke that sounded harmless but carried an old, tired stereotype. Lila paused before responding, choosing her words carefully. "That might sound funny to some people," she said calmly, "but it's not fair to judge someone just because of the way they look." The room fell quiet. Some students nodded. Others looked surprised. The boy who made the joke mumbled an apology, clearly caught off guard. Lila didn't press further. She simply smiled and went back to work, knowing that sometimes even small moments could lead to big changes. Outside of school, the town continued to shift. The police department had started a new youth outreach program where officers volunteered time to mentor students after school. At first, many kids were hesitant to participate, still holding on to the pain of past experiences. But slowly, trust began to build. Some students even started attending voluntarily, talking with officers about school, sports, and future goals. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward. Lila was invited to sit in on some of the early meetings between the police chief and community leaders. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the conversations around her. Sometimes she shared her own thoughts. Once she suggested that officers should spend time in classrooms, not just for safety drills, but to get to know students as people. Her idea was met with silence at first, then slow nods of agreement. A few weeks later, a pilot program was launched where officers visited schools once a month to talk with students informally. Even within her own home, change was happening. Lila and her father talked more openly about the world, about power, about responsibility. He no longer saw her as just his daughter. He saw her as a leader. And though she still struggled with the weight of that title, she accepted it. Not because she wanted to be famous or praised, but because she knew there were still so many voices waiting to be heard. As summer approached, Lila received another invitation, this time from a national organization focused on youth empowerment. They wanted her to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C., alongside other young activists who had fought for justice in their own communities. She read the email twice, heart pounding. She thought about everything she had been through, everything she had learned. Then she typed back a simple yes. The weeks leading up to the event were filled with preparation. She worked with a speech coach, practiced in front of mirrors, and even recorded herself to hear how she sounded. Her father helped her pack, making sure she had everything she needed. On the morning of the flight, he pulled her into a tight hug. "You're going to do great," he whispered. "Just be yourself." When she arrived in Washington, the city buzzed with energy. The conference brought together hundreds of young people from all over the country, some older, some younger, all with stories worth telling. Lila met students who had stood up against unfair school policies, others who had organized protests, and a few who had even won legal battles for their communities. She realized, standing among them, that she was not alone. During her session, she took the stage with calm confidence. She told her story again, this time adding layers to it, how she had felt lost, how she had found strength in others, and how healing wasn't about forgetting but learning. She spoke about the importance of listening, of seeing people beyond appearances, and of fighting not just for yourself, but for those who couldn't yet find their voice. When she finished, the crowd erupted in applause. Strangers rushed up to her afterward, thanking her, hugging her, asking for advice. One girl clung to her tightly and whispered, "I'm going to start speaking out too." Lila smiled and nodded. "You already are," she said softly. Returning home, she felt both lighter and heavier than before. Lighter because she had spoken her truth to people who understood. Heavier because she knew the work wasn't done. Change was slow and some people still resisted it. There were still stories of young people being unfairly targeted, of bias showing its face in quiet, dangerous ways. But she also saw progress. In Maplewood, more students were stepping up to lead discussions about fairness. Teachers were including new perspectives in their lessons. Even the local newspaper had started publishing monthly columns written by students, giving them space to share their thoughts and experiences. One evening, as she walked home from a friend's house, she passed the same street corner where everything had started. She stopped for a moment, looking at the place where she had once stood humiliated and afraid. Now she stood tall. She took a deep breath and kept walking. That night, she sat at her desk and opened her journal. She wrote, "I used to think my story ended the day I got hurt. But now I see that it only just began. My voice is mine. My pain doesn't own me. And if I can help even one person feel less alone, then every hard moment was worth it." She closed the book gently, feeling something settle inside her. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, she woke up early, packed her bag, and headed to school like any other day. The sun was rising, casting golden light over Maplewood. Life moved on as it always did. But now, Lila moved with it, stronger, braver, and ready for whatever came next. Years passed and Lila's name became more than just a headline in Maplewood. It became a symbol of courage, change, and the quiet power of standing up for what is right. She was no longer just the girl who had been mistreated by the police. She was a voice that refused to be silenced, a young woman who had turned pain into purpose. As she grew older, Lila continued speaking out, not just in her town but across the country. She traveled to schools, community centers, and conferences, sharing her story with students, teachers, and leaders alike. She spoke about trust, about fear, about how people often judge others before they even know them. But more than that, she spoke about hope, about the kind of hope that grows from struggle, and the kind of strength that comes from choosing to rise after being knocked down. Back in Maplewood, the changes she had helped start continued to grow. The youth mentorship program between the police and students became a permanent part of the town's efforts to build better relationships. Schools updated their curriculum to include lessons on identity, bias, and fairness. Parents talked more openly with their children about how to handle difficult situations and how to stand up for themselves without fear. Even the mayor's office changed. Mayor Thompson made it his mission to ensure that every young person in Maplewood felt seen and protected. He pushed for new policies, worked closely with community leaders, and always made time to listen to the voices of the next generation. He knew that leadership wasn't just about making decisions, it was about learning from those who lived through them. Lila finished high school with honors, determined to keep moving forward. She applied to colleges with strong programs in social, justice, and leadership, eventually earning a scholarship to study public policy. Her father watched proudly as she walked across the stage at graduation, cap and gown gleaming under the bright lights, smiling with a confidence he hadn't seen in her when all of this began. At university, Lila found herself surrounded by people who shared her passion for change. She joined student organizations focused on racial equity, led workshops on youth rights, and even started writing articles for online platforms. Her words reached thousands, sometimes millions. People still remembered her story from Maplewood, but now they were listening to her ideas, her vision, her voice. One day, while working on a research paper about youth and law enforcement relations, Lila received an unexpected email. It was from a high school in another state, asking if she would come speak to their students about her experiences. She read the message twice, then smiled to herself. She clicked reply and typed a simple yes. When she returned to Maplewood years later, the town looked different but still familiar. The same streets, the same shops, the same peaceful feeling, but something deeper lingered beneath the surface. A sense of awareness, of growth, of healing. She visited her old high school and stood in the very classroom where everything had started. Teachers greeted her warmly. Some of them new, others who had been there since the beginning. Students gathered around, curious and respectful, eager to hear what she had to say. She told them her story again, not because it was easy, but because it was important. Afterward, a girl approached her quietly. She looked nervous but determined. "I've been stopped before too," she said. "Not like you, but enough to feel scared." Lila nodded, listening carefully. The girl hesitated, then asked, "How do I make sure it doesn't happen again?" Lila smiled gently. "You start by talking about it," she said, "by telling your truth, and by helping others find theirs." That night, as she sat on the porch of her childhood home, Lila thought about how far she had come. She thought about the little girl who once wanted nothing more than to be invisible, to live a normal life without attention or pressure. That girl had grown into someone stronger, braver, and more certain of her place in the world. Her father sat beside her, sipping tea and watching the sunset. He looked at her and smiled. "You've done good, kid," he said softly. Lila laughed, shaking her head. "Still got work to do," she replied. He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The next morning, Lila packed her bags again. There was another event to attend, another group of students waiting to hear her story, another chance to remind people that one moment, one act of injustice could lead to something powerful. As she stepped into the car, she looked back at Maplewood one last time before turning forward again. Because her journey wasn't over. It never really was. And somewhere, in towns and cities across the country, another young person was getting ready to tell their own story. Another voice was rising. Another heart was finding its strength, and Lila James was proud to have played a small part in lighting the way.